What would have happened if Germany had won World War II? The world would have taken a completely different course. By 2025, Europe would have become the political, economic, and military core of the Third Reich. The Germanic language would have predominated as the official language in schools, institutions, and the media. The concept of Lebensraum, promoted since the early days of National Socialism, would have fully materialized, expanding German borders eastward and displacing entire peoples to establish Aryan colonies. Multicultural societies would have progressively disappeared, replaced by ethnically homogeneous structures following the racial vision promoted by Heinrich Himmler. Cultural diversity would have been seen as a threat to the established order. Traditional Germanic values such as obedience, discipline, and duty to the state would have been fundamental pillars of education and public life. The impossible vision: what would happen to the world if the Allies lost World War II? The year is 1944. The world is at war. Operation Overlord, which in our story ensured the liberation of Europe, fails miserably. The beaches of Normandy become a death trap. Hitler, convinced of his invulnerability, launches a brutal counter-offensive that pushes the Allies back across the English Channel. Churchill, politically weakened, fails to gain a foothold even with the help of the United States, which is overwhelmed in the Pacific Theater, and the British leader is replaced. The United Kingdom, isolated, bombed, and without effective American support, signs a conditional peace with the Nazis. Nazi Germany installs a collaborationist government in London, and English morale rapidly crumbles. Universities are purged according to the criteria of the Aryan race Hitler dreamed of. The BBC becomes an organ of National Socialist propaganda. On the subway, speeches by the Führer are heard instead of music or local news. On the Eastern Front, the Russian winter was unable to stop Hitler's Wehrmacht, which brutally advanced on Stalingrad. The capture of Moscow in 1943 marked the end of the Soviet Union. Stalin was summarily executed, and various parts of Russia and the Soviet states became satellite provinces of the Reich, while others were reduced to slave reserves and forced labor gulags. The occupied territories were fragmented into districts directly subordinated to German governors, such as the Reichskommissariat. Moscovian, or the Reichskommissariat Caucasian, where the local language is suppressed, religious celebrations are prohibited, and a forced labor regime with inhumane productivity targets is enforced. Japan, for its part, wins the legendary battleship Battle of Midway against the United States. It conquers Hawaii and then Australia. Within a few days, the rising sun flag flies over Sydney Harbour. The local culture is subjected to a systematic process of Japanization. Historical monuments are demolished and replaced by Shinto temples, while traditional Australian architecture gives way to administrative towers inspired by the imperial style of Tokyo. Australia does not suffer the fate of occupied Russia, but the Japanese establish an industrial district with a local workforce governed by a greedy Japanese administration. Daily life is militarized. Children march in paramilitary school uniforms, and families must pay weekly homage to the portrait of the emperor. The educational system is completely restructured. Liberal studies are eliminated, and doctrines are taught about the supremacy of the Japanese spirit, the rejection of weak Western liberalism, and absolute obedience is promoted. In this new order imposed by Hirohito, all dissent is considered treason against the emperor and punished as such. In occupied Europe, concentration camps expand to new frontiers. Treblinka is replicated in the Urals. Dachau becomes the model for ethnic correction applied in all occupied areas. In these new complexes, such as Camp No. 17 in occupied Alaska, the conditions of human experimentation surpass the horror of any fiction. Joseph Mengele assumes a new position as Director of Research in the Reich Ministry of Science, and his brutality knows no bounds. The world is his new playground. Entire families disappear. Each camp incorporates its own laboratory, where the most sinister experiments are carried out on living, conscious victims. The SS installs a system of detailed records in enormous mechanical files on racial purity, political conduct, and work productivity. For prisoners, existence becomes a routine of hunger, silence, and absolute surveillance. The mere act of speaking without authorization can lead to summary execution. PA systems are installed that repeat party slogans throughout the day and night, preventing mental rest. The psychological impact is devastating. Many inmates lose the ability to speak, others develop automatic obedience syndromes, and a few cling to intimate moral codes, repeating prayers or mathematical formulas as their only refuge from dehumanization. Populations near the new camps around the world are forced to collaborate and live under constant paranoia. Any act of compassion toward an enemy of the Reich can be interpreted as treason. Terror is not only confined within barbed wire, it seeps into every home, every classroom, every whispered conversation in the occupied markets. Amidst so much confusion, fear, and despair, the only thing everyone knows is that a new world order has been imposed. New World Order, the New World Order that dominates the planet with an iron fist. With victory assured, the Third Reich establishes the Neuordnung, the New World Order. Western Europe is Germanized. The use of languages such as Polish, French, and Dutch is discouraged, with bilingual education offered to all levels of society. Some Axis-allied countries, such as Italy and Spain, are allowed to retain their languages as long as they also accept the bilingual model and eliminate local variations or regional languages such as Catalan. German is imposed as the official language, and school curricula are redesigned to portray pre-Nazi history as an ancient and horrible world, and Hitler as a savior, in the classic trope of civilization versus barbarism. In Paris, the Eiffel Tower is converted into a German state radio station. This wasn't necessary, but Goebbels considers it a great icon of conquest. The United States of America is fractured, and instead of a Berlin Wall, a Mississippi Wall is established, dividing the country into East and West America. Life under occupation varies by region. On the East Coast, now the American Confederacy occupied by Hitler's forces, the civilian population experiences a mixture of forced submission and adaptation. Traditional American culture is replaced by systematic Germanization. Music with African and African-American roots, such as jazz and blues, is banned, street names are changed to German ones, and churches are forced to incorporate Nazi party symbols. The Reich authorities govern alongside collaborationist elites who enjoy privileges in exchange for their loyalty. Some wealthy Americans who had supported Hitler even before the war enjoy privileged positions. Walt Disney is the new interim Minister of Culture, and Henry Ford, the new Minister of Industry and Transportation until his dying day. The education system is restructured to instill National Socialist values and eradicate liberal thought. The secret police, present in every neighborhood, foster a culture of fear and denunciation. Meanwhile, on the Pacific Rim, called the North Pacific Protectorate under Japanese rule, daily life is governed by a strict imperial hierarchy. Citizens are ranked according to levels of trustworthiness, and those deemed problematic are imprisoned in re-education camps. In schools, children learn Japanese history, revere Emperor Hirohito in mourning ceremonies, and practice calligraphy with kanji characters. Traditional American holidays are replaced by celebrations from the Japanese calendar. Despite surveillance, resistance networks persist in both occupied territories. Clandestine libraries, hidden radio stations, and secret communities that teach history and forbidden literature, but more on that later. Daily life is an exercise in constant vigilance and adaptation, where Americans learn to survive amid silence and subversion. In East America, city names change. Boston becomes New Orleans, Neuendorf and New York become New Berlin. Cultural identity dissolves, replaced by an oppressive fusion engineered by propaganda ministries and ideological architects. Hollywood falls into the hands of Goebbels and is transformed into a state-run studio producing Aryan heroic films and stories of samurai honor. In Latin America, fascist regimes flourish. Argentina, Brazil, and Chile become client states of the Reich, as well as summer resorts for Nazis and Japanese nobility. Local universities adopt the Nazi model of racial instruction. Africa falls exclusively into German hands. The Reich turns the continent into its primary geographical resource for raw materials, fossil fuels, rare minerals, and precious stones. In the new Viceroyalty in Africa, or the Viceroyalty of Africa, the Axis colonial powers reintroduced slavery under the euphemism of hereditary servitude. Men, women, children, and the elderly worked tirelessly and in the worst conditions, mining and harvesting crops for the Reich. In countries like Congo, South Africa, and Sudan, pockets of local or British resistance were drowned in blood. The Vatican survives, but under constant surveillance. The Reich's intelligence services monitor every sermon, every encyclical, every activity of the clergy. Many cardinals mysteriously disappear or are replaced by figures aligned with the regime's ideology. Pope Pius XII is mysteriously assassinated and replaced by a pontiff of German Aryan descent who chooses the name Victor III, a figure reduced to ceremonial authority who delivers speeches carefully supervised or directly written by Goebbels, which avoid any criticism of the new order and promote the inhumane outlook of the Reich. However, in the catacombs of Catholicism, a hidden fervor persists. Clandestine priests celebrate secret masses in basements, record and distribute pamphlets with subversive gospel messages, reinterpreting the teachings of Christ as a call to moral disobedience in the face of totalitarianism. Those who manage to escape the occupied cities become missionaries or Jesuits, seeking refuge in the religious communities of Southern Europe and Latin America, which become centers of an insurgent spirituality that fuses martyrdom with political resistance. At the same time, new forms of religiosity flourish in secret. Syncretisms between Christianity and ancient forbidden liturgies, such as Judaism and certain Russian mystical movements, serve as a refuge and coded message of hope amidst the imposed dogma. The global economy revolves around the Reichsmark. Oil from the Caucasus, rubber from the Congo, and lithium from South America are monopolized by German conglomerates. Japanese technology fuels the industry of control, armored bullet trains, automated sensor systems, and genetic coding. Under this new order, progress is subjugated. The world advances in science only to the extent that it reinforces control, purity, or dominance. Japan, for its part, advances in domestic robotics and urban surveillance systems. Science ceases to be a tool and becomes an instrument of hatred. The evolution of horror, scientific and technological development in a world dominated by Hitler. In a world dominated by the Axis, science is not free, but rather a slave to power. Research exists not to liberate human beings, but to chain them more efficiently. With the fall of Bletchley Park and the execution of Alan Turing in 1944 for espionage and ideological subversion, primarily due to his homosexuality, the development of computing in the West stagnated. Without the breaking of the Enigma code, the cryptographic supremacy of the Third Reich remained intact for decades. Lorentz cipher machines were improved and distributed throughout the German military and civilian apparatus. In return, the race for computing took a different path. In Berlin, a proto-digital network of biometric punch cards integrated with genetic censuses was developed. Every citizen of the Reich was classified, tracked, and registered from birth. IBM, nationalized by the Reich after the annexation of its European offices, supplied the holorith machines that powered this bureaucratic panopticon. Rudimentary behavioral prediction algorithms are designed based on the inaccurate and dubious studies of Cesare Lombroso, the Italian physician and criminologist who dedicated himself to developing methods to identify criminals based on their traits. All those considered to fall outside the German ideal are marked as imperfect or potential dangers to civil society. The arms race also takes a radical turn. The Reich's Wunderwaffen, or miracle weapons, cease to be marginal projects and become the center of German power. V-2 rockets evolve into orbital missiles. In the mid-1960s, Berlin successfully tests the Silbervogel, a suborbital aircraft capable of bombing New York from the stratosphere. In Tokyo, meanwhile, the Yokosuka XZ-12 project, led by scientists who escaped from the Tokyo Tribunal, develops kamikaze drones guided by rudimentary optical guidance systems. Atomic energy, in the hands of the Axis, becomes a symbol of supremacy. Although the Allied Manhattan and Alsos projects failed to materialize due to their defeat by Hitler, Germany manages to detonate an experimental nuclear bomb in the Kazakh desert in 1952. The world witnesses, for the first time, a radioactive mushroom cloud. Tokyo, in response, militarizes its secret nuclear program in Manchukuo with portable reactors for tactical use. Medicine advances in parallel with dehumanization. Science Minister Mengele creates the Reich Institute for Genetic Improvement and leads genetic engineering experiments aimed at producing a homogeneous racial elite, modifying the embryos of pregnant women to conform to Aryan standards. Among the working classes, eugenics becomes public policy. Couples with hereditary defects are sterilized. In Japan, the Imperial Institute for Technological Development perfects biological modification techniques to create soldiers resistant to extreme cold and radiation. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens live under a dictatorship of algorithms. Every step is tracked, every facial expression recorded. Homes are equipped with acoustic sensors that identify forbidden words. In the Reich, the mandatory bow before the portrait of the Führer is monitored by gesture recognition cameras. Those who fail to comply face re-education or disappearance. Universities are no longer centers of open knowledge. Philosophy, the arts, and social sciences are suppressed. Only what is useful to the regime is taught. Mathematics applied to ballistic control, engineering for the Reich's infrastructure, racial biology. Architecture reflects this new dogma, megalithic, cold, and totalizing. Albert Speer, Hitler's favorite architect who had served as Minister of Armaments and War Production, becomes the architect of the New World. Hitler commissioned him to design monumental cities, and Albert Speer responded with his famous policy, Die Ruinenwerttheorie, or ruin value theory, which proposed that buildings are not only constructed to be used by contemporaries, but also to arouse the admiration of those who will encounter them in a state of vestige 1,000 years later. Berlin becomes Germania, a metropolis designed after the megalomania of ancient Rome, to humiliate and diminish the individual. Columns 100 meters high, ministries covering square kilometers. A hybrid style was adopted, combining the Roman classicism dreamed up by Hitler with Soviet brutalism, which, despite being rudimentary, proved effective, economical, and utilitarian. Granite and concrete bury the human scale. Tokyo responds by completely rebuilding Kyoto and Osaka in an imperial futuristic style. Towers with curved roofs, marble corridors, and gardens designed to symbolize the harmony between the emperor and the machine, a coexistence between a glorious past and a prosperous future. Propaganda presents this advancement as the pinnacle of civilization. But for the average citizen, modernity isn't progress. It's surveillance, standardization, silence. Televisions broadcast a single channel. Books must be registered. The Reich's home computers are precarious with monochrome screens, similar to those used by the KGB in our timeline. They only allow access to programs certified by the Ministry of Control and Information Technology. Knowledge is encapsulated, sealed, and dosed. The world has entered an era where technology no longer liberates, but silences, where man doesn't dream of stars, but of obeying unnoticed. Captive culture, the development of art and culture under the Third Reich. Under Axis rule, art no longer expresses, it obeys. Culture, once a reflection of human diversity, becomes an instrument of indoctrination. In areas controlled by the Third Reich, every cultural manifestation is filtered by the Ministry of Propaganda. Books, paintings, songs, films, and literature, everything must praise the greatness of the state. Authors such as Kafka, Freud, Joyce, and Sartre are banned. Book burnings become a daily routine, and those who keep hidden copies are hunted down and summarily executed. Public libraries are transformed into selective archives where only texts that reinforce Aryan doctrine are allowed to be read. Children's literature extols obedience, sacrifice for the homeland, and the purity of the Germanic spirit. Goebbels orders the creation of a department of literary profiling dedicated to rewriting classics of world culture but adapting them to Nazi ideology. Degenerate music with Jewish, African, or Gypsy origins such as jazz, swing, blues, and any regional folklore is eradicated. In its place, martial music and Germanized folklore prevail. Beethoven is reinterpreted as a precursor to the National Socialist spirit, and Wagner becomes the official symbol of heroic art. Reich operas are staged with monumental sets, soldiers' choruses, and librettos corrected by political ethics committees. Cinema, one of the most powerful instruments of Nazi and fascist propaganda, undergoes a complete transformation. In the former Babelsberg Studios, now renamed Staatliches Kinozentrum Germania, or State Film City, similar to the Italian Cinecittà, produces epics about racial conquest, biographies of the Führer, and technological fantasies glorifying Aryan superiority. Horrible dystopian films can also be seen depicting how horrible the world would be if the Allies had won World War II. The films are shown in free theaters, where attendance is mandatory at least once a week. Walt Disney is dedicated to making proselytizing films for children, which extol the greatness of Hitler and teach them manners according to Nazi standards. In the Japanese-occupied zones, imperial aesthetics prevailed with implacable subtlety. Nihonga, a traditional Japanese painting style, was transformed into official art. The prints of Hiroshige and Hokusai were reinterpreted as prophetic visions of the Eternal Empire. Animation studios such as Toei and Nippon Eiga, they produce epic works where children sacrifice their lives for the emperor. Ancient samurai stories are rewritten to erase any hint of doubt or rebellion. Only absolute obedience remains. Local traditions are eradicated or reinterpreted to fit the imperial narrative. In the Philippines, for example, traditional dances are transformed into military choreography. In Korea, Korean names are outlawed and historical festivals are replaced by celebrations of Hirohito's birthday. China is the most difficult region to impose culturally, and the Japanese prefer to blend their traditions with those of the locals, making them more tolerable. Language becomes a battlefield. Japanese is imposed in schools, newspapers, and urban signage. Local literary works disappear or are rewritten with imperial values. The media is completely controlled. Radio broadcasts speeches by the Führer and newsreels praising the victories of the Reich. In Japan, radio stations broadcast readings from the Kojiki, the founding text of the empire, while professional narrators recite patriotic poetry accompanied by taiko drums. Television is limited to newsreels, military parades, and contests rewarding doctrinal loyalty. In rural areas, compulsory loudspeakers are installed, repeating slogans day and night. Dissident artists are persecuted and sent to concentration camps, gulags, or disappear without a trace. Some join underground counterculture movements. In Berlin basements, groups of poets recite forbidden verses by candlelight. On the California coast, exiled musicians from the old jazz tradition gather to play in code. The culture of resistance is written on the margins. Graffiti with quotes from Camus or Primo Levi, hand-copied manuscripts, plays performed in private homes under extremely confidential surveillance. Fragmented identity dissolves in a sea of propaganda. The generations born after the Axis victory grow up without knowing any other narrative. They believe that World War II was a just crusade, that humanity was saved by purity. That diversity was an eradicated disease. In schools, children learn that history begins in 1945, with the rise of the new order. Thus, art no longer provokes, questions, or liberates. It only serves power. Culture has been taken hostage by an empire that only tolerates the echoes of its own voice. Soulless progress, the dystopian science of the Third Reich. Science is a powerful tool. In the wrong hands, it becomes an instrument of control, of moral mutilation, of absolute domination. Under the Axis regime, knowledge is not freedom. It is surveillance, eugenics, and technological repression. With his new position as minister, Josef Mengele transforms his experiments at Auschwitz into standard protocols, which are replicated in dozens of centers, from Greenland to occupied Tibet. Children are classified according to cranial asymmetry, vocal elasticity, and speed of response to painful stimuli. Genetics, stripped of all ethics, becomes a classifying machine of purity. Advances in biotechnology allow for the implementation of mandatory genetic registries. Every European citizen must carry an invisible biometric code tattoo. This data feeds central archives in Berlin, where algorithms, operated by rudimentary Zusi Z4-type computers, decide on reproductive, mobility, or employment permits. Those with hereditary defects, a history of heart disease, severe myopia, a history of depression, homosexual tendencies, or proven mixed-race children are sterilized without consent. In the Reich's medical system, there are no patients, only functional units. Pain is an acceptable variable if it contributes to efficiency. Hospitals, such as the Kaltenbrunner Institute in Prague, specialize in prolonging the lifespans of slave laborers through forced surgeries, experimental prosthetics, and the use of psychoactive drugs. The goal is not to cure, but to maintain life. In the occupied territories of the Americas, Nazi technology is adapted to the local infrastructure. In the American Confederacy, auditory implants monitor exposure to propaganda. Devices known as Gehirnwächter or mind guards are installed in classrooms and factories. They detect emotional patterns considered dangerous, such as melancholy or excessive euphoria. Those who show deviations receive effective recalibration through forced neurostimulation sessions. The Japanese Empire, for its part, focuses its advances on robotics and urban surveillance. In Tokyo, Seoul, and San Francisco, armed autonomous vehicles, a kind of precursor to drones, patrol streets, scan faces, and apply instant sentences based on digital obedience scores. Homes are connected to a central network of home robots, domestic assistants that report every conversation, gesture, or behavioral anomaly. Refusing to have one is considered a sign of subversion. The space race didn't disappear, it became a symbol of supremacy. In 1954, Germany installed a rudimentary orbital base called Wotan 1, in reference to the Norse god Odin. From there, martial hymns, images of the Führer, and zero-gravity experiments with human embryos were transmitted. Japan responded in 1958 with a space station that served as an orbiting laboratory. The all-seeing eye, the sinister technology of control in an Axis-dominated world. Axis rule is not sustained by brute force or propaganda alone. It is primarily technology, transformed into a whip and a watchdog that perverts the destiny of millions of people around the Axis-dominated world. A world without privacy, without shadows to hide behind, without space for intimacy, where there is only paranoia. Such is civilization under the all-seeing eye. To maintain control over all inhabitants of the occupied countries, the Third Reich founded the Digital Identity Institute, tasked with developing mechanisms for identification, surveillance, and behavior prediction. In its laboratories, located in the Bavarian Alps, the first networks of automated urban cameras were designed, connected to analysis centers that cross-reference demographic data, movement patterns, and behavioral records. This system, evolved from the first closed-circuit television systems, became known as the Oral Network and soon covered every city in the Reich and its occupied territories. Each citizen is assigned a PPC, or personal purity code, a number tattooed on the left arm or implanted subcutaneously, depending on the region. This code contains not only racial, medical, and occupational data, but also an emotional record generated from verbal interactions, facial expressions, and levels of perceived obedience. It also includes one of Lombrosian's simplistic approaches to predicting criminals. These codes themselves establish a sort of subversion ranking. The lower the ranking, the less dangerous one is to the Reich. In the world dominated by the Empire of the Rising Sun, the vital network system operates on similar principles. Using acoustic sensors in homes, classrooms, and offices, it analyzes the emotional intonation of speech, so it isn't even necessary for a citizen to report another. The system only needs to register persistent sadness, misdirected anger, or prolonged silence to request an educational visit, that is, officials who are tasked with removing the emotionally unstable person. As the years pass, surveillance technology evolves. The streets are patrolled by surveillance automatons, whether robotic dogs with proximity sensors, driverless vehicles that analyze public gatherings, or hot air balloons with parabolic microphones. Every train station has eye cameras that measure pupil dilation to detect nervousness. In government buildings, elevators are activated only through biometric readings, fingerprint or iris. In schools, every desk had pressure and heart rate sensors. In homes, screens are mandatory, so every family has at least one state-run television that constantly broadcasts speeches, anthems, and productivity reports, and which can be turned on automatically if the government so desires. But it also has a camera, like modern laptops, so prolonged absence from the device, or in the case of speeches by the Führer or the Emperor, is grounds for investigation. Domestic privacy is destroyed, the family lives under surveillance, and even whispered prayers can be interpreted as signs of ideological heresy. Population movements are monitored by a mandatory digital bracelet or an implanted microchip. To take a train, buy bread, or visit a relative, the device must be scanned at stations connected to the Ministry of Internal Control. The algorithm decides whether to grant permission. If the individual is flagged for subversion or suspicion, they are immediately detained. Bodies were not private property. Rural areas, long isolated, are now controlled by governments. In vast expanses of China's countryside, enormous surveillance towers with solar panels are installed, just as in the agricultural regions of the United States or the African countryside. From these towers, drones launched floating loudspeakers that repeated slogans like mantras: "Order is life, silence is health, the Führer sees you, the Emperor hears you, work liberates." As computing develops and new computers and hard drives appear, data centers in major cities store millions of gigabytes of information about humanity. A typing error, a smile at a misunderstood sentence, a fleeting glance at illegal graffiti can mark the end of a life. The punishment is automatic: freezing of bank accounts and expropriation of personal assets, erasure from the civil registry, disappearance without trial, without lawyers, appeals, or witnesses. With luck, only a digital report sent to the family. Your relative has ceased to exist by order of national destiny and the good of the Reich. Little by little, technology ceases to be a tool and becomes a master, a faceless master without a schedule, without mercy. A god manufactured in laboratories whose only commandment was perfect obedience. The dream of dictators, to control not only what you do, but what you think, and even worse, what you haven't yet dared to think. Born of fear, the education and life of those born under the Axis regime. It's one thing to conquer the world, another, more ambitious, thing to conquer the minds of the future. For the Third Reich and the Japanese Empire, military victory in World War II was only the first step. The essential thing was to mold a new humanity, incapable of even imagining freedom. Therefore, children born after 1950 in this new order know nothing else. For them, war is a myth, democracy a meaningless word, and freedom is the limited possibilities they have within their social conditions. There is no merit or possibility of social advancement. They are the children of fear, raised not to think, but to obey. As Mussolini had already proposed in the 1930s when he said, "The correct Italian is the one spoken in Rome," and Franco would later follow with mandatory Spanish throughout Spain, education became the primary ideological battlefield throughout the Axis territory. School systems were redesigned from the ground up. In Germany, the Ministry of Education and Purity established a pedagogy centered on total obedience, physical training, and the idolatry of the Führer. School textbooks began with quotes from Mein Kampf and ended with exercises in denouncing one's neighbor. Children were taught that informing was an act of patriotism, that love of country was superior to love of family, and that independent thought was a symptom of genetic deviance. In Japanese schools in the Pacific Protectorate, children began the day kneeling before a portrait of Emperor Hirohito, reciting verses exalting the divinity of their lineage. History is taught as an unbroken imperial epic. There are no defeats, no crimes, only glory and destiny. Calligraphy is used as a discipline to enforce absolute attention. Any error in the form of kanji is considered a lack of national spirit. Mathematics is used to explain racial superiority through statistical problems. In biology, eugenic theories are studied. In history, all mention of the Holocaust is eliminated, renamed the Great Patriotic Purge, or of resistance movements, which are called the Ancient Evil. Instead, it is taught that past enemies were traitors to the natural order. Geography presents a world map where all countries have new names imposed by the Axis and where no border exists without the approval of the Reich or the throne. Recesses are patrolled by school brigades, based on the model the SS implemented in the concentration camps, where some students are designated kapos and rewarded for reporting any suspicious behavior among their peers. In many high schools, children who denounce their own parents receive medals and academic benefits. School is not just an obedience factory, it is a training ground for emotional betrayal. Re-education programs go beyond the classroom. For young people who show doubt, disobedience, or empathy towards subversives, there are youth reform centers. Inspired by some Hitler youth indoctrination centers, these centers isolate young people in camps, where they are indoctrinated through exercises and meetings with party leaders. There, the same is repeated ad nauseum. The Führer loves you, the Emperor protects you, your doubt is treason. The generations born under the Axis have no past to remember, but there is one thing the regime cannot erase: intuition, a vague suspicion, buried in language, in untaught gestures, in dreams that don't obey propaganda. Those fearful glances from their parents, those topics that are forbidden at the family table but make grandparents' cheeks shiver. Those fearful glances at images of the party, there begins the rift, there perhaps begins the future. Shadows in the empire, the first vestiges of the global resistance. In a world dominated by the Axis, hope turns into crime. But even in the darkest corners, resistance breathes, fights, and survives. The totalitarian regimes of the Reich and the Japanese Empire have built a system based on fear, surveillance, and the rewriting of reality. But no tyranny is absolute. Across the planet, beneath layers of silence, movements flourish that refuse to accept the yoke. In the former Soviet colonies, in the forests of Belarus and the ruins of Kiev, remnants of the Red Army survive. They no longer fight with tanks, but with sabotage, clandestine radio stations, and lightning attacks on key Reich infrastructure. They call themselves the Faceless Ones and operate without visible leaders to avoid infiltration. They wear masks with ancient Slavic symbols and bear a single motto: to remember is to resist. In occupied Western Europe, small insurgency cells operate from secret churches, underground bookstores, and abandoned metro stations. In Paris, the Echo Libre group prints pamphlets with coded poems. In London, the Second Commonwealth, led by former MI6 agents, organizes rescue missions and document forgery. Its existence is a war against oblivion. In the fractured United States, resistance takes multiple forms. In the American Confederacy, African-American groups, hidden Jews, and repentant collaborationist ex-military personnel found the underground network, a chain of tunnels, safe houses, and coded transmissions connecting cities like Atlanta, Detroit, and New York. They use signals in musical scores, altered cooking recipes, and symbolic tattoos as communication codes. On the Pacific coast, Japanese control is more rigid but not absolute. In the valleys of Oregon and the mountains of California, former military personnel, liberals, Native Americans, and dissidents form the FOG communities. Their members live in isolation, create alternative technologies, and transmit pirate radio signals with messages in Esperanto to avoid detection by Japanese censorship systems. The neutral zone of the American border is a hotbed of tension. Although dominated by the SS, its fragmentation makes it a critical point for smuggling and escape. Clandestine leaders organize sabotage attacks against trains and checkpoints. Their members use disguises stolen from the enemy and tell false stories in multiple languages to breach the walls. Each successful crossing is a moral victory. In Latin America, resistance takes on diverse forms. In Argentina, young university students create the Libre del Sur movement, which infiltrates radio stations with subversive songs and political manifestos hidden in vinyl records. In Mexico, peasants and rural priests form the Agave Guard, a guerrilla group that defends indigenous communities from the plundering of natural resources by Reich corporations. Their motto is simple: land, memory, and language. In Africa, the struggle is existential. There, imperial racism is brutal and needs no mask of humanity to hide it. In the Congo, the Black Star Army attacks German mines and convoys from the jungle, while in South Africa, a group called Ubuntu Libre brings together former prisoners and dissidents to sabotage genetic laboratories where experiments are being conducted on the local population. Death is almost certain, but the members know it. Their motto is, "If we stop fighting, we will not be able to remember that we existed." Even in Japan, the center of the empire, dissent exists. A small circle of artists, engineers, and former soldiers works in the shadows to preserve the memory of imperial crimes. They record hidden documentaries, falsify documents, and leak information through devices camouflaged in traditional kokoshi dolls. Women play a central role. On almost every front, from the streets of Rome to the deserts of Syria, they are spies, clandestine educators, and nurses of the resistance. They encode messages in embroidery, organize mobile shelters, and raise the next generation among tales not included in the regime's books, tales where the evil dragon always loses. Even with all their machinery of control, the Axis empires cannot erase the human yearning for freedom. Every forbidden song hummed in the darkness, every word written in the margins of a textbook, every gesture of silent disobedience is a crack in the wall. The world endures in whispers, in shadows, in fire. Because even if official history declares absolute victory, the truth does not die. It hides, transforms, and awaits its moment. The spirit in the fire, the resurgence of resistance to fascist regimes. When the Axis sealed its victory, the world seemed doomed to decades, perhaps centuries of totalitarianism, but even in the darkest night, sparks of insurrection arose. The resistance, scattered, persecuted, and fragmented, began as a murmur. Whether it was a poem read in secret, a radio tuned in at midnight, or a clandestine leaflet hidden among textbooks, the ideal was there. Over time, it transformed into an underground international network made up of unlikely alliances, daily courage, and absolute sacrifice. In Europe, resistance cells are reactivated after the first decades of occupation, in line with the capitulation of the last Allied governments. In France, the resistance is once again operating from the old tunnels of the Paris metro, coordinating sabotage against Nazi arms factories. Following tales of the exploits of their fathers and grandfathers, they destroy locomotives, leak secret documents, and help deserters escape to Switzerland. In Poland, the Second National Army acts as a shadow government, with courts, secret schools, and makeshift hospitals. All it takes is an ideal and a handful of brave souls, although being caught in these activities means death. In Germany itself, former opponents of the regime are reappearing underground. The remnants of the White Rose Group, their apprentices, and other university intellectuals are rewriting banned philosophical treatises and pre-Reich history books, adapting them into code for students loyal to the truth. In small circles, Kant, Marx, and Freud, whose works had been banned, were studied. Education was transformed into resistance. Revisionism was the new paradigm for young people. Mississippi Wall, the internal American border dividing the territories occupied by Germany and Japan, became an insurgency corridor where the SS were constantly outwitted or attacked by surprise. The Rocky Mountains served as a hiding place for fugitives, clandestine transmitters, and mobile libraries. Former American soldiers, persecuted intellectuals, and displaced peasants organized night caravans to cross the neutral zone with medicines, weapons, and manuscripts. Despite the great efforts of the Axis, education remained one of the most fertile fields of resistance. In each occupied zone, the school system was transformed into a tool of indoctrination. Falsified versions of history were taught without critical reading, and the virtues of the Reich and the Emperor were exalted as absolute truths. In response, so-called paper schools emerged, clandestine institutions that operated at night in abandoned churches, deactivated train stations, or private homes. There, real mathematics, critical philosophy, world literature, and science were taught without censorship. These schools, influenced by the ideas of educators such as John Dewey, Maria Montessori, and the Brazilian Paulo Freire, seek to humanize the new generations, resist institutionalized brainwashing, and prepare future leaders of change. The reading of forbidden books is done in a low voice, under the dim light of hidden candles. Each lesson is a conspiracy against forgetting. In the Pacific territories, resistance takes on a different character. The Japanese had imposed an extremely dense structure of social surveillance. Neighbors spied on neighbors, schools functioned as centers of ideological monitoring, and public rituals of obedience were mandatory. Despite this, in Hawaii, California, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia, insurgent movements find cracks. In the Philippines, the Army of the Free Spirit, composed of former Allied soldiers and local guerrillas, uses the jungle as a refuge. They set up pirate radio stations that jam official broadcasts, distribute pamphlets with Christian symbols reinterpreted as calls to insurrection, and sabotage imperial infrastructure. In San Francisco, urban resistance consists of networks of bilingual youth who hack propaganda broadcasts, reprogram electronic advertisements to broadcast censored poems or libertarian proclamations in English. Of course, women are fundamental in the new struggle against Axis global domination. In a world dominated by a masculine, racist, and militaristic ideology, many women found forms of covert subversion. As nurses who falsified medical records to protect patients the Reich considered defective, teachers who hid and recited copies of Shakespeare, or seamstresses who embroidered messages in textile codes. Groups of nuns formed a vast network, as they had already done in the occupied countries during the beginning of the final solution, to provide safe passage to Jewish or mixed-race children, or children whose parents were considered enemies of the state. In Japan, even within the empire itself, dissidents emerged. Buddhist monks critical of imperial militarism, teachers dismissed for refusing to teach racial hatred, and mothers clandestinely teaching banned haikus with pacifist messages. But resistance also found its violent methods. Sabotage, targeted assassinations, and armed insurgency began to be common, especially in the Balkans, the Swiss Alps, and certain urban regions of the Americas. Despite the brutal repression, each action was a declaration. Oppression was not total. It couldn't possibly be so. Little by little, it began to become clear that there were more dominated citizens than dominant military personnel. Of course, the Axis response is always ruthless: ethnic cleansing operations, collective punishments, the destruction of entire villages, and indiscriminate reprisals. But the bloodier the repression, the more it fuels the conviction that tyranny can and must be challenged. On the margins of fear, another form of civilization is born, fragmentary, subterranean, and fragile, yet profoundly human. The resistance of peoples is never a conventional war, but a struggle for memory, for truth, for the soul of the world. And although many of its combatants die without seeing a day of freedom, their legacy is the invisible heartbeat of all dissent, that even when totalitarianism cloaks itself in inevitability, conscience cannot be occupied. Cracks in the empire, the internal political problems that would lead to an internal war in the Axis. Every tyranny presents itself as invulnerable, but history teaches us that empires don't always fall because of external enemies. Often they crumble from within. In fact, the Rome Hitler always admired was punished by its own corruption, not by any external factor. In the decades following the Axis victory, with a world living under the dominant yoke of Nazism and Japanese nationalism, resistance fuels the discontent of those in power and cracks begin to open, silent, deep, and inevitable. By the end of World War II, the victorious side had established a treaty to divide the spoils, delineating the spheres of influence between the victorious powers: Europe, Africa, and Western Eurasia under Nazi control, East Asia, Oceania, and part of the Americas under Japanese rule. North America was divided into two large protectorates and a neutral zone between the Rocky Mountains. Despite everything seemingly being clear, mistrust never disappeared. As dominance consolidates, tensions between Berlin and Tokyo grow. Both powers see themselves as pillars of a civilizational order, but with radically different visions. For the Nazis, history culminates in Aryan dominance and supremacy. For the Japanese, it is imperial cultural supremacy and their divine mission to liberate Asia. Coexistence was always forced. In fact, Germans and Japanese never saw each other as equals, just as Hitler did not see the Italians, despite his admiration for Mussolini. The first signs of a rupture emerge in the border regions. In what was formerly the United States, German military personnel from the American Confederation accused their Japanese counterparts, responsible for the North Pacific Protectorate, of infiltrating agents into Nazi territory to foment civil disobedience among Germanized citizens. Tokyo, for its part, points to German economic expansionism in Korea and Vietnam as acts of provocation, while rising energy costs practically monopolized by the Reich's extractive policies in Africa and the former Soviet Union add fuel to the fire. Disputes intensify with the information war. Both blocs begin to sponsor clandestine networks in each other's territory. Berlin finances Buddhist dissidents and guerrillas in the Philippines. Tokyo promotes anti-Nazi movements in Poland and the Caucasus. This gives rise to a kind of Cold War between allies. Beneath the surface, global control is being fought over between two very clear powers, an axis that the world could never leave behind, just as it couldn't in our timeline, West versus East. Of course, not all instability comes from outside. Within the Reich itself, ideological tensions begin to rise. After Hitler's death, a brutal political struggle for succession erupts. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, proposes a purified, mystical, theocratic Reich in its worship of the Aryan destiny. Or the Übermensch, Hermann Göring, on the other hand, defends an expansionist technocracy based on industry, order, and economic power. The Wehrmacht, Germany's traditional military force that agreed to adapt to the Reich's madness, feels increasingly displaced by the growing power of the SS, which has become a state within a state, with its own factories, courts, and universities. Secretly, many officers in the military high command once again conspire against the Nazi leadership to restore Prussian honor and dismantle the radical ideological apparatus of the SS. The Wehrmacht had already attempted to eliminate the Führer once during Operation Valkyrie, and that failure had not been forgotten. The result of all these conflicts is a police state in constant internal purges. Every year, generals disappear, professors are executed, and entire regiments undergo preemptive cleansing purges. In the Japanese Empire, the conflicts are more subtle, but no less corrosive. Emperor Hirohito, transformed into a semi-divine figure, is increasingly symbolic, while military factions seize real control. The army and navy compete for resources, territory, and prestige. Factions emerge, such as a group of ultranationalist officers promoting the total militarization of the archipelago and the resumption of a war of conquest towards Siberia. Some, more traditionalist sectors fear that the empire may be becoming a copy of European fascism, losing its Japanese soul and dignity, which places honor above all other values. Within universities like Kyoto and Shinto temples, thinkers are beginning to emerge who advocate a spiritual restoration, opposed to both Nazi materialism and imperial militarism. Instability also spreads to the fringes of the empire. In Ukraine, resistance movements are fueled by sectors of the Nazi army that prefer to negotiate with insurgents rather than follow the genocidal orders of the SS. In Manchuria, Japanese settlers are attacked by their own subordinates, dissatisfied with the brutal exploitation of Chinese peasants. In Latin America, a relatively free but highly surveilled area, organized crime is intertwined with espionage networks that sell information to both empires, playing on tensions. Neutrality is a farce. The entire continent is a ticking time bomb. The apparent unity of the New World Order is, in truth, a delicate balance between conflicting ambitions, mutual hatreds, and crisscrossing paranoia. Each bloc prepares the ground to betray the other while watching its own back. In reality, both the Nazis and the Japanese realized that the war is not over. It had merely changed form and was about to return.